if you can point to a metric or some sort of organizational measure and say, for example, sales were 100 million last year. We did this learning effort of some sort, and now our sales are double, or defects are down, or safety incidents have improved, or whatever the case might be. And that's the ultimate tie your learning to performance, which admittedly can be challenging.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your co-host Jonathan Donald, founder of the change management firm Invert Ventures, and your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell & Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
On today's episode, we'll discuss ERP organizational learning with Mr. Mike Taylor. Mike is a learning consultant and an adjunct professor at Franklin University. Mike's work consists of merging learning, design, and technology. Mike helps organizations take their learning programs to the next level by integrating research-based practices from marketing, learning, and technology. He shares that empathizing with the learner is his most valuable skill. And as a consultant, Mike advises organizations on the best approaches to achieve learning and performance goals. Jack, I'm really excited to have another L&D conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the intro. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Mike today. On this episode, Mike will share with us the primary mission of L&D, or learning and development, primary L&D objectives, the role of organizational culture and effective learning, research-based L&D practice, L&D as a competitive advantage, tactical pointers to creating an organizational learning culture, the role of trust, and more. So let's get started. Joining us from the Columbus, Ohio area, Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to explore some of those topics you just mentioned.
And thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And we are certain our listeners will enjoy this conversation as well.
Absolutely. And Mike, first off, welcome. And to get us started, please tell us a little bit more about yourself. What's behind the introduction? As though you were directly speaking to our listeners. What do you think they want to know?
Yeah, so I'm totally love the process of learning. I'm energized by the process itself. I'm really grateful to be working in a field that involves learning in all of the different forms that it takes. And in fact, even when I was a kid in school, I was never the kid who was complaining about getting out of school because, I think learning is pretty cool. And, every time we travel somewhere with my family, my kids know, hey, there's a historical marker, go over there and you can learn something. And so really it's just sort of ingrained in me pretty deeply. And I'm grateful to work at something that I love that passionately.
So, Mike, what exactly is a learning consultant and what is their primary mission?
Yeah, so that's a great foundational question. And I think unlike some other jobs, I think it really is really what it sounds like pretty much. So the way I would define that is that a learning consultant is someone who advises organizations on how to get the most out of their investment and their efforts in a learning context. And, we'll get into that as we go along a little bit deeper. But, that can include, introducing them to a suite of options, which goes beyond training, which is just sort of one tool in the toolbox. Learning and training to me are really definitely not the same thing. And I think leading learning organizations, they go beyond just training and they incorporate things like performance support and communities of practice and collaboration and a whole host of other tactics, not solely relying on training. And, I think that's a common challenge is a lot of people, even some within the field, they only see training as the only option. So a learning consultant can help expand that type of thinking to see, what are better opportunities, what's possible, what are best practice approaches, and really solving whatever challenges they're dealing with.
Well said.
Yeah, there's a lot there that really resonates, especially this idea of helping them see more than just training. And Mike, I want to explore that in our next question. So on your website, Mike, you say that unpacking objectives and designing high impact solutions, as well as staying on top of current advances and changes in learning technology, are the three primary objectives of L&D professionals. And if those are the three focus areas, can you link this to your answer of what is a learning consultant? How do you help these learning professionals and companies really expand what they do and their orientation to L&D?
Yeah, and I think, one at least one part of that harkens back to the earlier comment about empathy, right? So being empathetic and putting yourself in the shoes of the people that you're trying to reach and the people that you're communicating with. One of the ways that we do that is, we talk about some of the teams I've been on, we would talk about unpacking certain things, which means, maybe this isn't clear enough, maybe it isn't simple enough. Commonly, especially in technical areas, people throw around a lot of acronyms. I'm glad you defined what L&D was there a few minutes ago, and that's an example of unpacking things. So really getting things as streamlined, as clear, as efficient as possible. One of the things I talk a lot about some commonalities between learning and marketing, and one of the things I wish everybody was as good at as marketers is their efficiency of messaging, which I think is really important. 90% of us probably think that we're great or better than average communicators, which is, obviously impossible. So putting yourself in the shoes of the people you're trying to reach, most messaging that I see can definitely benefit from some degree of unpacking. And then, technology makes it easy, which can sometimes be a double-edged sword. So, when we're applying that technology, we have to use that empathy to understand what the recipient's going to experience. As you guys know, and probably everybody else listening probably knows, we're bombarded by thousands, if not tens of thousands of messages from so many sources every day that, it's important to sort of marry those two things, the technology with your messaging.
So, Mike, what role, if any, does organizational culture have in effective learning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love that one. And organizational culture is a huge, huge factor when it comes to learning and, most other things for that matter as well. My personal belief is if you can bake learning into the culture of your organization, the faster and better organizations learn, the better they perform. I think it's, if not the most important skill for an organization, it's up there and definitely in the conversation. Great learning companies are effective at creating and acquiring new knowledge and then transferring that and applying that to whatever their business is. There's an old Jack Welch quote that says something to the effect of, an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly. That's the ultimate competitive advantage. And I may be a little bit biased because I'm in this field, but I really do believe in that idea.
There's the idea, too, that innovation and creation obviously is a huge indicator or factor with organizational learning, but also this idea of learning comes with failing, right? So the more often that you fail and try new things, that's actually a good thing. And I think that some organizational cultures that promote this idea of managed failure helps expedite, effective learning as well.
Yes, and culture is a huge part of that, right? Like the safety to feel safe enough to be able to try new things and fail and learn from that and move on and not be chastised or worse for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I really love the attention to culture that you're pointing out here. So, Mike, you had a presentation where you were exploring the intersection of learning, design, and technology. And I find that really curious. So, can you tell us a little more? What is that intersection and why is it valuable?
Yeah, so for me, that's really where I focus the vast majority of my time and thinking and efforts and all that sort of stuff. So I think to me it's a sweet spot. If you think about, all of those things individually are pretty powerful, but if we can combine those in a way that's synergistic so that we can get a situation where the sum is greater than the individual parts, I think there's a huge opportunity there for no matter what type or size of organization that anybody can do this. I talked a little bit about learning being the thing that drives so much of the other things that happen, success and failure in an organization. We have to do that in a way that's thoughtful. So we can flip on a bunch of technology, but if it's not done strategically and well thought out, that can be more harm than good. I think we're all familiar with that. And so we have to do this in an intentional way. We can't just start flipping switches on and assume everything's going to be great. But when we do this right, the integration of these three elements, I think, is the best way that we can maximize the effectiveness and the efficiency of the organizational learning that we're doing. And then in turn, the actual ultimate performance of the organization as well.
So, Mike, you state on your website that research-based practices from marketing, learning, and technology are highly relevant to your practice. And if you were to distill your own practice into fundamental principles, what would you say they are? What makes an effective learning professional?
Yeah, a couple of things we've touched on maybe a little bit before. I think two of the foundational things are the empathy that we talked about earlier. So empathy for what you're doing and the impacts for folks. And the second piece to that, which I think is equally important, is curiosity. And I say curiosity in the sense of exploring, are there new ways to do things? Are there better ways to do things? What are other people doing that works? And I see people at times where, I'm good, I'm on cruise control, I'm just kind of doing my thing. And that's maybe okay in some scenarios, but our world changes so fast today that I think, if you're not looking to expand and continuously learn, if you don't have that curious element to some degree, that you're falling behind. Certainly, if you have an organization that's in that mode, that you might be okay for a while, but probably long run, it's probably not going to pan out for you. And in terms of, we talk about research-based things, I think everyone, when it comes to learning, is used to what they've seen. And, we all have certain intuitions of what we think learning should be, whether that's, lectures that you've seen from school and stuff like that. I think it's really important to pull in some evaluation, like, are the things we're doing making an impact? Because really, as learning professionals, training and learning, that's not our goal. That's just sort of the means to get to some sort of performance outcome. And so I think we've got to do some research-based practical things that impact results and transfer our learning into the desired actions that us and our organizations are looking for. So those are some of the things. And I think in practice, when you go to implement thing, I think there's sort of three things that sort of drive everything that I do. And I think the first one, I talked earlier about the efficiency of messaging from marketing, is streamline things, streamline your messaging. If you're building a course, cut out the fat, streamline it as much as possible. That sort of goes hand in hand with the unpacking idea that we talked about earlier. A second thing, and this is another thing that we sort of look towards marketers as doing better than L&D as a field, is make it emotional, right? Tap into emotions, make it mysterious or funny or sexy or scary or whatever that is. The way that our brains are wired, a lot of times people just think, oh, I'm going to roll out a whole bunch of facts and figures and everybody will go off and do what we want them to do. And that's not the way humans and our brains work. There needs to be some sort of emotional trigger in there to get that. That's why you see, a lot of the advertising that you see, very different from probably the training that you see. And then the last thing that sort of helps with both of those first two, if you can effectively use visuals, so photos, video, multimedia, whatever it is, if you can do that well, that will help you streamline and tap into emotion. So I think those three things together really make a nice package when you're doing anything.
I like that response, Mike. Thank you. The insight, and my takeaway in your answer was really, sound principle is great, but sound practical application of those principles is just as critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what I'm noticing there is that the principles inform the practices, and so that it's not either or; it's actually both and. I really love that as a principle and a practice. So, Mike, you mentioned earlier that learning can be the ultimate competitive advantage, and you cited the Jack Welch quote. You have a quote in one of your articles that I'm going to share now for our listeners. The good news for the field of L&D is that learning is more important than ever. I believe that learning has always been the ultimate competitive advantage. But don't just take my word for it. There is a growing body of research suggesting that the long-term financial performance of learning companies is significantly superior to that of their closest competitors. End quote. So, Why then wouldn't every company not have their own L&D department, just like companies have their own HR, IT, quality assurance, or service delivery? What's going on in the way companies think about L&D that leaves value on the table? And then how do you approach companies to explain that there's value here?
Yeah, so I think that's great. I love the way that you asked that, and I absolutely do agree with the idea that every organization should have a department, a person, whatever that is, who is leading the learning effort, which I think at times can be very different from a traditional L&D department. I think leading learning spans often multiple departments. So we have obviously technology and collaboration, communication. It's rare that you see that all sort of housed together in the same place. So I think
Sure.
that's maybe part of the challenge. But I think those people who are responsible for sort of quote unquote leading learning, I think they could effectively sit anywhere. The challenge with a lot of traditional approaches is, hey, we have an L&D department, but really, in fact, they're the quote training department, and they're doing a lot of tracking compliance related requirements and who came to a classroom and that sort of stuff. And so what we've got to do is, if you're really truly searching for learning and effective learning, you've got to employ a much bigger tool set than just training. Like we talked about earlier, it's got to be communications and collaboration and performance support, and it's got to be this whole suite of things, working in conjunction. So I think that's part of why some people may not have an L&D department, but I think that learning function is really critical for the long-term success of any organization.
Mike, I really love that. And I want to go a little deeper here. So if we're talking about shifting from L&D as a training focus to L&D being somebody in charge of organizational learning. So what stands in the way of that shift?
Oh gosh, there's a lot of potential challenges with that. I think the important part is in a lot of organizations, it's not rewarded. People don't make time for that. I think it's really important if you're really in a true learning organization. I've seen some that do this, but the people that are really successful, they make time for it. They reward it. They incorporate it as part of the job. So encouraging, incentivizing people to not only learn themselves but help share what they know and employ this concept of sort of working out loud, that can be hugely beneficial. There's other important factors in there that you guys just mentioned about experimenting. Don't be afraid to experiment. What did you learn? But then don't keep those learnings to yourself. Share that. And so part of that learning responsibility is teaching people how to share that. A culture that encourages it and sees it as a positive instead of a negative. Some of those things combine, and that's the type of stuff that powers organizational learning that keeps you ahead of your competitors. We can go a little deeper into that if you want, or I can give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, actually, Mike, let's go a little deeper. You mentioned don't be afraid to experiment, which to me is a bit of a tactical pointer, I would say. So, based on your answer to Jonathan's question, as well as your answer, I think, in part to the culture question, if you are a leader of an organization, you would want to do everything you can to help your learning culture evolve. So, what are some tactical pointers that leaders should consider?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things that are really foundational and important is look for ways to leverage any sharing spaces. So a lot of times that could be a Microsoft Teams, Yammer. There's tons and tons of platforms and tools that you can use to facilitate conversations. I think conversations is another thing that L&D people should look to, not just being an expert or providing an expert to dispense knowledge, but connecting people who are actually doing the work and facilitate those conversations and the flow of information. So think of a big national corporation. I used to work for a power company, and the power plants were all over the country, but none of them were in contact with each other. So somebody working on a water system in Texas may have solved a problem that a bunch of other places are grappling with, and facilitating those types of conversation can be really invaluable. So sharing spaces and letting people find each other and find common expertise and topic areas is huge. Part of that, or extending upon that a little bit, is looking outside your own walls. So no matter how smart the people are in your company, there's more and smarter people outside. And so being able to tap into that, within your own industry and even beyond in other industries. And a lot of times in the course of history, when we've had significant innovations, it's really not necessarily a totally new invention, but it's the combination of two existing things from different fields you applied in a new way. And so being able to look at things from that different perspective is invaluable.
I think that's a really, really insightful point and ways to be able to do this. So, Mike, now that we're getting a sense of what stands in the way, so how exactly is achieving learning and building a learning culture in an organization accomplishing organizational performance and goals related to it? What's the connection? How do you see it? And then how do you make the case for leaders to see it?
I think there's two things here, right? Organizations can't scale learning when it's just a few people creating content for a lot of the others to consume. We sort of have to move to this expectation of there's a lot of people creating and consuming learning together. And the ultimate goal and the outcome of that and any other type of learning is how do you transfer that to the business goal? So, what are the outcomes? What are the results? And I think any learning professional would gladly say, hey, we don't have to do any more training. If I can get the results without training, the business results, we can skip all the training. It's virtually impossible to do that. But really, the outcomes are the ideal that we're shooting for, and transferring our learning into action and into beneficial actions is really where our value as a profession, I think, comes from. And ideally, this is often hard, and a lot of people will talk about this. But if you can point to a metric or some sort of organizational measure and say, for example, sales were 100 million last year. We did this learning effort of some sort, and now our sales are double, or defects are down, or safety incidents have improved, or whatever the case might be. And that's the ultimate tie your learning to performance, which admittedly can be challenging.
I really like that, Mike, and it reminds me of, you probably familiar with the 4 levels of training evaluation, the Kirkpatrick Model.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And, I think you mentioned some great points. It isn't just about the learning. It's about the reaction to the learning, the behavior, and the results, which are the 4 levels of training, as noted in the Kirkpatrick model, which I think is a fantastic model. But I think often those outside of the L&D profession, and maybe some in the profession, a lot of times forget just how valuable that level 4 is, right? And the transfer of that knowledge to the workplace, right? That's how you achieve the organizational performance results that you're looking for.
Absolutely. That's the ultimate goal for everything that we do. And even if we think about our own profession, so if listeners are in whatever profession you're in, think about the shelf life of knowledge. I know in the course of my career, the shelf life of knowledge, it used to be you could go to college as an engineer, have a 35-year career, and you wouldn't need to refresh on the knowledge that you came out of school with. That's no longer the case. We've shrunk the knowledge life from 30 years to maybe 3 to 5 years. And so you think about everybody's having to continually learn new things. And it really is the case where the learning is the work, because we just can't spend an entire career and not continue to upgrade our skills, or we'll be out of work virtually in every field, not all, but most.
Yeah, exactly. So, Mike, I want to refer another one of your articles. I thought it was well done and interesting and thought-provoking, but you had an article that caught my attention called "Wired, Not Tired. Is Curation the Cure for What Ails You?" And I want to share a quote here in that article, but you said, quote, "Think about it. Isn't a lot of the work L&D already does really just a form of curation? The process of creating a course is virtually the same as the curation process. You start by identifying your goals and doing some analysis of your audience. You identify topics, and that leads you to a collection of resources from which you call the best information to present in the proper context," end quote. Can you explain more to our listeners what you mean by that?
Yeah, so in a traditional approach, if we're thinking about courses and classroom things, either you're the expert or you're interviewing experts, and we're trying to hopefully start with some end goal. So we're learning a new software system, we're rolling out a new product, a new sales process, whatever the case might be. We're starting with that end goal, and then we're collecting a bunch of stuff. We're doing interviews, and we're doing research, and we're reading books, and whatever that may look like. And ultimately, we're going to pare that down and unpack it as much as possible, and we're going to come out the other end with a course or some output, right? Some learning content. And that is great. It typically takes a lot of time. It's expensive. And, it rarely, if ever, gets updated once those types of things are finished. If we think about rebalancing what we're doing and the sort of content that we're putting out, if we look towards, implementing a curation practice, this is content that typically already exists. Similar to an art curator in an art museum, right? There's a lot of stuff, but I'm trying to take that and tell a story and achieve a goal. So, there's bazillions and bazillions of content, created online every day. Yeah. It's very rare that something you need is not already in existence. So instead of recreating the wheel and doing our own internal version, curation is the process of, okay, well, let me seek this out. Let me find that sort of best of class stuff and organize and present that in a way that can be a lot faster, a lot more agile, a lot less expensive. And, if you do it well, can be just as effective, if not more effective, than the traditional approach that has historically been used.
Great points. And for our listeners, we'll be sure to include a link to that article in our show notes as well.
And I'll just add one other thought to that too is Jane Hart has done some surveys, some workplace learning surveys, and her findings tell us that the people we're serving, so our fellow colleagues and the audiences, that's the type of learning they value the most. So knowledge sharing, web resources, daily work experience on the job stuff. She has some survey results that support not only can it be better, faster, all those things we talked about, but the people we're giving it to value it much, much more than traditional, courses and classroom type experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. Back to the Kirkpatrick model, that first level is, how receptive are people to the training to begin with, right? What's their reaction? And I think the more that you provide the proper tools and the more receptive they are, the better the training experience and the better the results in the long run.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm really loving the stakeholder perspective that you're bringing here. Not only is it more efficient for the organization, it's also something that our people want and are more receptive to. And so I love the win-win-win that's implicit there. I want to take that and leverage it into our next question. There's a lot of discussion I hear about trust and, as you mentioned earlier, empathy and its role in organizational learning. And so I want to give you a chance to discuss it. I also want to ask you, for a true learning organization, what kind of assumptions or beliefs or mindsets do leaders and the organization need to have to actually build those behaviors in that system and that culture of learning? Can you speak specifically? Trust might be one, empathy, but I'm really curious, what needs to be believed in people before this really comes alive?
Yeah, the topic of trust is a really great one. And I think, ultimately trusting in people. So people who are closest to the work, as a general rule, know best what needs to be done. And so, somebody sitting in a corporate office somewhere assigning curriculums and giving learning paths and all this stuff is good to some extent. But we have to trust that the people doing the job know best what they need and the things that they need to learn, and sort of enable them and trust them that they can go out and do that. And that's not to say we're just going to forget about them. We need to facilitate that learning and support it and help them along the way. But I think trusting them, the people that are doing the work, the people that are closest to it, as I mentioned earlier, conversations between each other and with each other, like connect those people together. There's a place for both of those. There's a place for expertise to share knowledge and wisdom, but there's also a corresponding place for, there's people doing the job. There's what the official blueprint says. And then there's when you get down on the shop floor, the official blueprint's not going to get it done. And I've got a certain trick or a tip or a hack or something that's the real job to get it done. And so I think trusting people to navigate that is really important. Obviously, trusting that you're putting out information and materials and training, like I could probably go, 100 different ways about the importance of trust, but I think that captures it pretty well. And I think that's a great way that you just frame that.
And Mike, I think everything you just said in response to Jonathan's question, I could probably distill down to one word that you've mentioned a couple of times on our conversation today. But you talked about conversations between and with, and mentioning that there's a place to be an expert, but there's also a place for the non-official blueprint, as you mentioned. But if I had to distill your answer down into one word, I would say empathy.
Yeah. I also think, another thing that goes with that conversation around experts is almost every one of us is an expert in something. So there may be an expert on X system, but there's probably somebody who's running that system in a certain place in a certain location who's the expert on that specific implementation in that specific environment. And so I think the way we frame and define expert is another way that we can sort of trust that people know what they're doing and honor the value that literally everybody can bring to an organization.
So true. Well, Mike, this has been a pleasure. It's been so much fun speaking with you. Great advice, great insight. And our last question is, I think it's probably between Jonathan and I, one of our favorite questions. And that's simply because we believe in collaborative learning. And as you had mentioned in Jonathan's question, and just providing more information about yourself, it comes down to learning. And it's kind of a continuous process, right? That's how we all develop and grow as individuals as well as organizations. But as fellow practitioners, we absolutely benefit from learning from our colleagues and our friends, both the boots on the ground, the researchers, all of the stakeholders. We all have something to learn from each other. But how would you summarize this conversation? And that is, if you had to distill your work, your experience, your skill set into 3, 4, 5 sentences, what would you offer up to our listeners? And what would you offer up to other L&D professionals? And what would you offer up to ERP organizational change practitioners?
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. I think kind of continuing some of our thread from before is make a regular habit of connecting. So that can be connecting with peers who do what you do, connecting with the audience that you're trying to serve. Put some form of connection, whether it's industry events or as simple as, having coffee with somebody who does what you do or leader in your field. One of the great things about working in L&D is there are so many people in this field who are more than willing to share what they're doing and what they've done and what works and what doesn't work. It's a really amazing thing that you've got to take advantage of. And I think making a habit, making that connection piece, we said learning's part of the job. And I think part of that learning in the context of a job is connecting to learn with others, to your point of social learning. One of the things that goes along with that is don't just limit yourself to your own field. Look beyond. I've said several times now that there's a lot of things L&D people can steal from marketing. I think there's some common goals that we share with marketing, but I think in a lot of cases they do it maybe a lot better for a whole host of reasons. And then, facilitating knowledge, sharing things. So if you learn something yourself, find a place to share it. So share it when you're making those connections, enabling other people to learn from you. And one of the things that helped me a long time ago, especially when it comes to social media, which has really a bad name, I thought, well, who am I? I don't have anything to share. There's nothing, I haven't invented some great new thing. But at some point along the line, I sort of switched that thinking to, if you're learning something that's beneficial to you, there's probably other people who are similar to you who can also benefit. And I think if you sort of couch your knowledge sharing in the sense of helping others instead of trying to promote yourself, I think that takes down some of the barriers and makes it more comfortable for people to share. Again, this kind of comes back full circle to, learning is the work.
Yeah.
And I think if you can do those things with empathy and curiosity, that no matter what field you're in, it's going to take you a pretty long way.
Wow. Well said. That's fantastic. Mike, thank you so much for your time today. We really do appreciate you and your time and sharing your insight with us. For our listeners, please be sure to check out miketaylor.org. That's mike-taylor.org, and we'll be sure to include that in our show notes as well. And Mike, can you tell our listeners what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty easy to find online. You mentioned my website. I have a free newsletter I do every week around a lot of these things that we talked about. So if you're interested, you can grab that. Or if you have questions even, be happy to have those as well. And I speak at conferences and other events. So would love to be able to run into one of you guys or maybe one of the listeners sometime. That would be really fantastic. And thanks for having me on. This has really been fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. We really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure, Mike.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges. We discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change by drawing on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. We are incredibly grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us in our podcast as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community and contribute to its success by bringing research and practice closer together. We want to make sure this is the most useful and insightful ERP podcast you listen to, and we'd love your help in doing so by leaving us feedback and a review. A great place to do so is at Apple Podcasts. Just click on the Listen in Apple Podcasts link, then click Ratings and Reviews, and let us know your thoughts. You can get more info about the show, including show notes and episode highlights for this and all of our episodes, by visiting NestellAssociates.com and clicking the podcast option. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. And don't forget to follow us on social media, #TheERPOCJ. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic week.